Hello and welcome to the podcast Shedding Candlelight on Cryptids, Hauntings, Mythology, and more. This is your host, Lee Donna, and today's episode is all about giving that special someone in your life the perfect gift, the kind of gift that sticks with a person, grows with them, molds them, something they will cherish. A gift that will change not only the recipient's life, but the lives of everyone around them for generations to come. To find our gift-giving guru, we must travel back to a time and place that made this sordid tale of a haunting possible. It all began in East Prussia on July 10th, 1826, when a man named Joseph Otto was born. This man held from nobility, his lineage tracing back to Otto the Great of Prussia. Prussia officially became Germany in 1871, but sometime prior to that date, there was a revolution during which Joseph Otto fled his homeland. He hid in a load of hay and made his way to London, where he encountered a 12-year-old girl whose petticoat of her dress was stuck on a fence. Joseph helped her out of this sticky situation, and 6 years later, Joseph Otto married this now 18-year-old girl. By 1862, Joseph and his wife were in the United States, where Joseph Otto set up a medical practice in Key West, Florida. They were wealthy and lived in a big house, and in 1865, they had a son named Thomas. A few years later, in 1868, Minnie Elizabeth was born in the Bahamas. And in 1872, Minnie traveled to Key West, Florida with her family, and in Key West, she remained. In 1880, back in Germany, where Dr. Joseph Otto is originally from, a seamstress named Margaret Steiff began selling elephant-shaped pincushions. Children fell in love with these plush elephants, and being a business-minded woman, Margaret Steiff left off making pincushions and instead turned her focus to making all manner of stuffed animal-shaped toys for children. Based in Geigen, Germany. Yep, I know I didn't pronounce that correctly, but you guys are not coming here to hear words pronounced correctly. If you are, you shouldn't. The Steiff Company was founded in Geigen, Geingen, Germany, and was very successful in the plush toy business. So much so that in 1897, Margaret's nephew, an art school graduate named Richard Steiff, joined the company. He drew more complex designs and is reportedly the first person to design a stuffed bear with movable limbs. Meanwhile, back in the United States, 95 miles north of Cuba and at the southernmost end of U.S. Route 1, Key West, Florida is watching a new home being built on Eaton Street, just a stone's throw away from the beach, since Key West, Florida is a series of islands off the coast of Florida. And for the book nerds out there, this home on Eaton Street is only 0.6 of a mile away from Hemingway's house. Out in this island community that's as far south as you can get in the United States, Thomas Otto, now also a doctor like his father Joseph, and Thomas's wife, Minnie, who was born in the Bahamas, they built a grand colonial Queen Anne-style home. This beautiful structure had graceful columns, verandas, and a round turret or tower peppered with windows where one could take in the magnificent view. The Otto family, Thomas, Minnie, and their 3 children moved into this stunning home in 1898. Then on October 25th, 1900, their fourth child and youngest son, Robert Eugene Otto, was born right there inside of what is today called the Artist House. A few months later, in 1901, the 26th President of the United States was sworn into office. The following year, in 1902, there was a cartoon published in the Washington Post depicting U.S. President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. From this cartoon, the stuffed bear became known as the teddy bear, thus making stuffed bears more popular than ever, which was good news for the Steiff company because only 1 year later, in 1903, an American company placed an order for 3,000 of the Steiff company's movable limbed teddy bears. From there, Steiff company plushies became very popular in the United States. Maybe this is how our gift-giving guru first heard of this toy company, or maybe she knew about them because her father-in-law, Joseph Otto, was of German descent and kept in close contact with his family back in his homeland. All of them sending and receiving not only letters, but gifts. Either way, in 1904, Minnie Otto herself was traveling through Germany. While there, she stopped at the Steiff company and purchased a birthday gift for her youngest son, a doll that was dressed in a pink and green clown outfit that was adorned with pom-poms, those little fluffy decorative balls. This doll was of a unique size, standing 40 inches tall or just under 3.5 feet. Later, it would be said that the size of the doll perfectly matched that of Minnie's son at the time, making it truly a life-size doll for little Robert Eugene Otto. Some people even say it was the little boy's spitting image, his mirror twin. While this likeness is debatable, we do know the doll is made of both felt cloth and cotton fabric, and it's stuffed with wood slivers, commonly referred to as wood wool or excelsior. Today, this wood wool is used in erosion control mats and bonded products such as wood wool boards. But back in the day, it was common to find this product being used as padding in upholstery or stuffing in children's toys. This doll's face is stitched in a way to give a little bit of a lift to the nose and the mouth areas, with the nose having little dabs of pink for nostrils and the lips being painted either red or pink. And there are even little black eyebrows painted above black button eyes. Most of these hand-painted features have faded, but several of the sources said it originally had features not unlike those of a jester, which is kind of creepy, but also expected because the Steiff company crafted this doll to be a literal clown, and it even came with its very own doll-sized teddy bear. So in September of 1904, when our globe-trotting mama returned from her trip abroad, she went back home to Florida, where she gifted her 4-year-old son, Robert Eugene Otto, with this one-of-a-kind doll. Shortly thereafter, Robert told his family that the doll picked a name. The doll wanted to be called Robert, and Robert the boy would henceforth be called by a shortened version of his middle name, Eugene, forevermore simply known as Gene. The family was okay with that because Gene loved Robert. The two of them were inseparable. The parents must have thought Robert the doll was even great for the child's imagination because they began to hear two very distinct voices coming from wherever Gene and Robert were playing. Of course, they'd go check things out to make sure no one uninvited was in the house, and all they ever found was just Gene and Robert. At first, they thought Gene was vocalizing for Robert and that it was all pretend. Later, they began to worry that the other voice they were hearing was coming from somewhere else, from something else. When they attempted to scold Gene for the things he'd done, furniture being knocked over or Gene screaming in a fit of rage, he'd look at them with the wide eyed innocence of a child and tell them, I didn't do it. Robert did it. Gene was always very emphatic that he was not the one doing these bad things. Still, as he grew up, he was Robert's constant companion. Gene had his family set a place for Robert at the dinner table, and even as a young man, Gene cherished his doll. He treated Robert as if he were a real person. The first time the two of them parted ways was on September 6th, 1921, when Gene went off to study architecture and the fine arts, first in Virginia, then Chicago and New York, before landing in Paris, where he met his future wife, a woman from Boston whose name was Anne with an E. She was a concert pianist, and the two of them wed in Paris on May 3rd, 1930. After Anne finished her studies, the couple moved to New York for a few years before Gene took his new bride back to Key West, Florida, to live with him in the Otto family home, the one Gene grew up in, the house where his beloved Robert the doll still resided. Anne instantly disliked Robert, as one would imagine a wife would when her husband spent his time turning the attic space above Anne's bedroom into a house for Robert. This attic is accessible by a narrow staircase, and at the top, there is what I call a scuttle door, where it's a hinge door flat on the ceiling that you push up and then crawl through. Gene filled this attic space with doll-sized furniture for Robert, like a table, a chair, and a bench. Gene even gave Robert different changes of clothes, some of them being Gene's old clothes from his childhood days. Being an artist and once again inseparable when it came to Robert, if Gene wasn't up in the attic talking to Robert and playing around, he would tell his wife that he needed to paint up in the turret room because the tower with all of its windows had the best light in the house. Gene would bring Robert down from the attic and take him up to the turret room with him. And while Gene worked on his art, he would often put Robert in one of the windows so the dog could look out at the view. Passers-by soon began to notice that they would glance up at the tower and see Robert in one of the windows, and when they'd look away and then glance back, he would be in a different window or just move to the other side of the same window. Some of these eyewitnesses claimed to actually see Robert get up and move all by himself, while even more said that his facial expressions would change, not day to day, but minute by minute, as if the doll was aware of what was going on around him. School children began telling stories about hearing giggling when they'd walk by the house, and according to some family acquaintances, Gene never grew out of blaming Robert for all of the bad things that happened inside of the artist house. Even when he abused his wife, Gene claimed it wasn't him, but Robert. Close friends of the family reported that Gene adored his wife, Anne, and would never be mean to her. And maybe he wasn't physically violent, but he most certainly was mentally abusive. People let Gene get by with a lot. He was eccentric and they loved his art, but Gene was also very jealous of his wife. She had a bright and sunny disposition. It's said that when Anne walked into a room, she would just light it up. Therefore, Gene made her stay outside for 5 minutes whenever they attended an event so that her entering the room wouldn't overshadow his presence, and he would get everyone's undivided attention for those precious 5 minutes. Jean's wife, Anne, was also a very talented musician, so Jean forbade her to play piano in public. Again, so her talent would not overshadow his. At home, he took pictures so that when Anne was doing what he considered to be her duty, cleaning up after him, and she would put everything back in its exact place, because if the woman was dusting and a single item in his home was moved even the slightest bit out of place, it would send Jean into a rage. Of course, whatever he did when he was upset wasn't his fault, but Robert's. Jean passed away in 1974, after which Anne said she wished she'd stayed in New York, where she'd been able to play her music instead of relocating and serving her husband so dutifully for over 40 years. You see, when Jean died, Anne found out that he cut her out of his will. She got nothing. And this after she'd come into the marriage with more money to her family name than Jean had. In fact, Anne's family had badgered her not to marry Jean because they told her that Jean was only marrying her for her money. Now destitute, Anne reached out to Jean's oldest sibling, his sister, who had been given pretty much everything. This sister told Anne that, of course, she could keep the artist house. The place had been Anne's home for the last 40 years, after all. Anne just couldn't have anything inside of the house. Even the pieces of art, furniture, antiques, and everything that the couple had bought together, presumably with Anne's own money, because back in those days, everything was said to belong to the man, no matter what. After 44 years of marriage, Anne was going to be left in a bare house with no money to refurnish it, let alone make any necessary repairs. His sister-in-law wouldn't even let Anne keep a portrait that Jean painted of his wife. So Anne did the only thing she could do. She sold the house to her neighbor and went back home to Massachusetts, where she lived with her sister until she died only 5 short years later. She is now buried in the Yantic Cemetery in Norwich, Connecticut. If you are near there, do go out and leave some flowers on her grave. Anne deserved so much more than what she got in this life. She's a bit like Zelda Fitzgerald in some regards. Men used to stand outside of Anne's home and listen to her play the piano because her music was just as lovely as Anne was. And then she married a loser instead of someone who would actually lift her up. Anyway, Anne did get stuck with Robert the doll, whom she left in the artist house, telling the new owners to keep that doll shut inside of the cedar chest that was up in the attic. The new owners didn't think too much about the doll in the box in the attic, and they rented the house out. 2 men signed the lease, and at first things were fine. Then they started hearing noises coming from the attic. Giggling, someone shuffling around up there. So the men climbed the stairs, pushed open the scuttle door, and found that Robert was no longer in his cedar chest. He was out, casually sitting in one of the chairs. This pattern continued, with the 2 men going to investigate strange noises, footsteps, clings and bangs, only to find Robert in different places around the attic room, sitting here and there, his legs crossed in different positions, or even standing with his arms draped over the back of one of his chairs. A plumber doing work in the home reported hearing giggling. He turned around and saw Robert, the doll, now sitting on the opposite side of the room from where the doll had been when the man first arrived. Another tenant in the home claimed that Robert locked him in the attic for over a week, and when the man came down with yellow fever, he blamed the illness on Robert the doll. Another story says a family who had a 10-year-old girl lived in the home. This girl took one look at Robert and fell as hard for him as Jean had. She wanted to be Robert's constant companion. But unfortunately for her, Robert was not into it. He tried to smother her in her sleep. The girl's dad, rightfully angry, locked Robert back in the trunk in the attic. Shortly thereafter, the dad is found dead in his car that was parked right there in front of the artist house. There are reports of the artist house being haunted by something other than Robert, with people reporting seeing Anne herself walking down from those attic stairs. One theory of why her spirit returned to that house and that the reason that she's there is to help keep Robert's wrath at bay. Other reports say that objects fly across rooms and furniture is moved, the underlying belief being that Robert's spirit still haunts the house. I submit to you that some of the paranormal activity might be from this poor father who is trying to warn people about the demon doll, echoing Anne's feelings about locking Robert in the attic and not letting him out. Unfortunately for Myrtle Reuter, a woman who purchased the artist house, instead of getting the memo and locking Robert up, she too became his constant companion. She didn't live in the artist house the entire time she owned it, but in 1994, shortly before her death, Myrtle donated Robert to the Fort East Martello Museum right there in Key West, Florida, a museum that eccentric artist Jean Otto had a hand in, being the architect of the museum's gallery. You know, the same way he was the designer of Robert's little home in the attic, which could be why Robert convinced Myrtle to take him there. Or maybe it was her own idea and she was not under the influence of the doll at all. Either way, the museum accepted the doll even after Myrtle told them that it was haunted and moved about her house all on its own and had even once locked her in a room. At first, the museum did not put Robert on display. He was kept in a storage room, and on occasion, people who knew the doll was there would ask to see him. The staff would begrudgingly indulge those patrons, but they really didn't want much to do with Robert because after he came to live in the museum, strange things began to happen. The atmosphere in the Fort East Martello Museum seemed to change. Lights would flicker and they'd hear ghostly giggling, slamming doors, footsteps, all the usual signs of a haunting. Eventually, because of high demand to see the doll, the museum conceded to the wishes of the people and put Robert in the gallery his beloved Jean had designed. When folks would visit the museum and take pictures of Robert, bad things would happen. The most mundane problems our photographers had were those of equipment failure. Batteries would drain when they would raise a lens in Robert's direction. The film would be ruined, and sometimes only in the sections containing pictures of the doll. Other museum visitors attribute much darker streaks of bad luck to their encounter with Robert. Strokes, car accidents, divorces, financial ruin, and death. Because of these traumatic events, the museum began receiving letters for Robert, people apologizing for making fun of the doll or for taking his picture, saying they didn't believe in the legend when they'd mocked the doll or broke his rules, but they believe in him now. Robert's wrath became such a big problem that the museum began telling people not to photograph Robert because the doll doesn't like it, and they cannot be held responsible for anything that might happen should anyone dare to break one of Robert's rules. People still persist, though, and this is why the museum continues to get letters of apology. Robert basically has his own mailroom, and even people who have never visited the museum in person will sometimes write to Robert asking him to lift a curse on them because they are so certain the bad turn their lives took only started after they laughed off tales of Robert and his power. So I ask you, do you believe? We do know as a point of scientific fact that objects hold energy. If spirits are energy, then it's possible one is residing inside of Robert. In the Florida Keys, there is a popular rumor circulated among the locals that the doll is connected to voodoo. In that region, there is a religion that came out of Cuba called Santería. Like most religions, it's been muddled with other ideologies because when you really trace those things back, it's the same ideas being regurgitated, only with elements added or taken away based on whatever ruling class is doing the regurgitation to make people obey based on their latest fear tactics. Santeria, among other things, has some blending of Haitian voodoo and Catholicism. And one thing I kept thinking of when I read Robert's legend was how in the Haitian voodoo religion, twins are highly valued. So much so that when one twin dies, the parents or caregivers of the dead twin will make an ibeji, a doll fashioned in the likeness of the dead twin. A doll that will then hold the spirit of this dead twin. Keep this in mind because we are going to make a hard circle right back here in just a few minutes. In Germany, where Robert the doll was manufactured and where the Otto family hailed from, there is a mythical creature called a kobold, Kobold. The kobold is mischievous, to say the least, and it goes by many names. One of them being a Pixie, which is part of the sprite subgrouping. Jean Otto, back when he was alive and making clothing for Robert, designed a Pixie outfit for his beloved doll. Curious. Furthermore, under this umbrella of Germanic kobold creatures, there's one said to live aboard ships. In one version of Robert's legend, it says that instead of being bought in Germany, Robert was bought from a man on a ship just off the coast of Florida. Other stories try to tie in the voodoo angle a little more by insisting the doll was given to Jean by a maid or a young girl of Bahamian descent. The Bahamas being one of those places where the voodoo religion is practiced. And we remember that it's also where Jean's own mother, Minnie, who gave him the doll, was born. I think the actual historical records, coupled with what makes the most sense, is that the doll was purchased in Germany by Minnie. A doll like this would have not been cheap, and it's just not the type of doll that would have been used in any sort of voodoo curse. But the doll could have had a stowaway pixie inside of it. It could have certainly been cursed after it was gifted to Jean, or Jean himself could have manifested and empowered an entity to live within Robert. Jean was said to be highly emotional and prone to fits of rage, so his instability could have conjured something from the deep, dark depths. Or just maybe a spirit was placed inside of the doll. And these rumors about someone of Bahamian descent having placed a curse on the family through the doll are true. It might have been Minnie, Jean's own mother, who put a spirit inside of Robert, or it might have been the wife of one of her husband's employees. You see, there was this little rumor going around. The good Dr. Thomas Otto, while highly revered and, well, people just thought he was as peachy as a slice of pie. But in hushed whispers, they commented on how he might not be the most faithful of men to his sweet Minnie. The whole Otto family was close to the Abbott family, who also hailed from the Bahamas. And William Abbott had been working for the Otto family since Joseph, Thomas's dad, had been alive and practicing medicine in Key West. William had a wife named Emmeline, and during the time when Minnie was giving the doll to her son Jean, Emmeline was sadly miscarrying a child, a baby rumored to be that of the good and honorable Dr. Thomas Otto himself. When Thomas died in March of 1917, Jean was only 16 years old. Shortly after his death, Emmeline Abbott attempted to sue the Otto family. She wanted money. For what? I don't know. But when Emmeline and her husband William died, they were both buried in the Otto family plot, which was highly unusual for that day and time because their skin was a lot darker than that of the Otto family. Curiouser still is that when Minnie Otto died, she was not buried in the family plot. Oh, the secrets the dead do tell. I don't blame Minnie for not wanting to be buried next to her philandering husband, if it was even her choice. And I'm glad Anne's eternal resting place isn't next to jealous Jean. Those Otto men filled up their burial plot with dogs, deer, mistresses, and who knows what else. They didn't have room for their long-suffering wives. Robert has room and time for all of his deeds, though, because he's earned himself the label of being the most haunted doll in the world, and he is still, to this very day, on display at the Fort East Martello Museum. Visit him if you dare. I do dare. A visit to this museum is going straight onto my wish list, and you can also stay in Robert's original home. The artist house is still there in Key West, beautifully restored and run as a guest house, so you can go there and stay in one of the rooms. Even the turret room where Robert and Jean both spent a good deal of their time. For some reason, I am not brave enough to do that, but I would probably stay in one of the other rooms. I will put links to the guest house and the museum in the show notes for you. And the museum does have a gift shop where you can buy your own Robert replica. I will not be doing that, but go ahead and pick up one if you are brave and not freaked out by dolls. They have life-size versions and also smaller ones for sale, all of which will make wonderful Christmas gifts, as long as you don't have a philandering husband whose mistress is going to put the soul of her deceased child into your doll. Another great gift they're selling is Robert's true biography written by David L. Sloan. This book is simply titled Robert the Doll, and it comes signed by the author. I highly, highly recommend this book. It has so much more detail than what I covered here for you today, and it includes old family photos of the Ottos and their home, and there's even a picture of Jean as a child wearing the same sailor suit that Robert still wears today. Maybe. One tag on Robert's sailor suit dates back at its oldest date to a time when Jean would have already been grown, but maybe some of the suit is original because most of the pieces don't have tags, and the curators of the museum seem to know that the hat wasn't original to the suit, but it's still old nonetheless, and David Sloan did a lot of research for his book, so definitely go to the museum's gift shop and grab yourself a copy. They ship super fast. I got my copy of the book in just a few days, but do not ignore their emails because apparently they need confirmation that you got their shipping information, and most people do not respond, which angers Robert because those workers at the museum take care of him. And at the slightest sign of disrespect, Robert will hit you with a curse. Do not take those kind of chances. Just check your emails and only say nice things about the doll. I'm actually afraid to include a photograph of him in the video version of this episode, and I kind of think I'll chicken out on taking his picture if I ever get to go to visit the museum. But maybe I will sketch him. There's no curse on drawing, right? I might find out soon, but what won't curse you is hitting that like button. Subscribe, rate, and review. If there's a button to hit or a thing to do, do it. I appreciate it. If you have show ideas, something you want to hear about, or you want to speculate on what you think is happening with Robert the Haunted Doll, my email is leadonabooks@gmail.com. My website is leadonabooks.com. And yes, my books are available to purchase directly from me. I have them in ebook and autographed paperback format, and they too will make great gifts for the readers in your life. If I don't have a stroke after I sketch Robert's portrait, maybe I will sell that as well. Probably not, but sometimes it's just fun to say these things. Today, I will leave you with what a reporter named Malcolm Ross said after visiting Robert and seeing the doll's facial expression change. He wrote, "There was some kind of intelligence there. The doll was listening to us."
Immortal Monsters.